I am currently working with a company called CrowdStrike, where I'm a GRC analyst, governance, risk, and compliance analyst. I've been in technology and security for just about 25 years. I'm pretty technical, so don't be afraid to ask me questions, and I will not be afraid to answer them. And let's get started. So today our talk, we're going to talk about cybersecurity threats, attack vectors, ransomware, a bit about why I feel, in my opinion, traditional security is failing. We're going to talk a little bit about what next-gen endpoint protection is, and it's going to be a little bit biased because that's what my company does, and we're going to talk a little bit about our take on it versus, what others might do. But I really want it to be an interactive session. I do want to cover the content, but I would love to have the interaction with everybody. So, cybersecurity threats. I'm intending to do this as like a real high level, not really getting too into the weeds, but if you'd like to get a little bit more into the weeds of ports and protocols and things of that nature, we can talk about a lot of that stuff. Let me know where you want to go with that. So since 2004, we've had a lot of data breaches. And in fact, most of the records lost have been lost very recently in the last probably 5 years. We keep breaking records on how many records are being lost in breaches. And they all have one major thing in common. They're actually implementing all the right technology. They've got their firewalls, they've got their antivirus, they've got their sandbox technologies for kind of contained malware explosion, intrusion prevention systems, application whitelisting, PCI compliance, things of that nature, but they're failing to stop the breaches. According to Verizon, and all of these numbers are out of Verizon's 2017 data breach investigation report. According to Verizon, legitimate user credentials were used in most hacking-related data breaches, with 81% of them using weak, default, or stolen passwords. So that alone should tell you something. And I have, we're going to start out with a kind of giveaway. What does it tell you? Social, yes. Social hacking. Weak passwords. What else? Former employees. Not quite yet. Anybody else? Really, passwords are not a great idea. Right? 81% of these breaches are being lost to passwords, so clearly they're not a great idea. But you were close, so you get the prize. Thank you, Bruce. So malware. Now, according to, and you'll notice that this particular arc of blue does not cover 51% of this circle. I'm sure you guys caught that already. I know that being in technology, I think it's a friendly neighborhood for people with OCD, but I wanted to point that out. This was updated. Last year, it was 40% of breaches were malware attributed. This year, 51%. But what about the other half of the equation, right? 49% according to last year, was 60% the year before that. These non-malware attacks are really serious. And these are being perpetuated by terrorists, hacktivists, cyber criminals, organized crime, and nation states. So, cybersecurity threats. Let's get a little bit closer. You can't really have a threat without an adversary because somebody has to do it, right? So these people are our adversaries. And our thought is that by understanding these adversaries, we can better design protections against them. And of course, it's a cat and mouse game, right? Adversaries are better funded, more sophisticated, and more patient than ever before. Attacks are well planned, They're very quietly executed using malware-free attacks, using encryption, and they clean up a whole lot better than folks used to be able to clean up. You hear, and I'm sure you've seen lots of movies about the script kiddies that do things, and you might catch them if you have some understanding of the technology. You might go, there's some technical inaccuracies there. They're not quite doing it right. It can become frustrating for some. But it's very important to understand. At CrowdStrike, we have a little bit of a taxonomy around our adversaries. And they can be nation-state adversaries from different countries. We kind of use their nation or their national animal. So China, pandas; Russia, bears; North Korea, kalimas, which is not quite a Pegasus, but a flying horse-type creature; India, tigers; and Iran, kittens. So an adversary profile, Rocket Kitten. Their operational window is between 2014 and now. Their primary objectives are to do recon, gain a foothold, move laterally, and then steal data. They're targeting aerospace, defense, and government organizations. They're using specific tools like Microsoft Word macros, Core Impact, which is a penetration testing framework, which is really quite slick. It's one of the most expensive ones out there. And it is a commercial solution as well. And it's also sanctioned software. They're using Gmail. How many of your organizations use Gmail? Right, so your organizations are going to let Gmail out of the infrastructure, so why not use that for command and control, or C2 as we call it. There's some other tools for credential stealing and for post-exploitation type stuff that you can do for gathering data, centralizing data, packaging the data up for exfiltration. Other adversary groups, we've got Singing Spider, Union Spider, Andromeda Spider. Those are all criminal groups. Hacktivist, terrorist type groups that we've also named Fraternal Jackal, Deadeye Jackal. Recent cases. You guys have probably heard in the news CrowdStrike before. We're typically associated, or we've recently been associated with the investigation into the DNC attack. And they're one of the few organizations that have allowed us to name them who they are. There are some of our competitors that it's like they have it in their contract that they want to be able to name and say who the customer is. We don't really like that at CrowdStrike because it's really kind of embarrassing. There's a whole lot of liability that goes along with it, and it doesn't help. So we were called in. The customer suspected that there was a large-scale phishing campaign that was done that caused a breach. The attackers had done a primary infection through that phishing campaign. Basically, you get an email and it's got an attachment or it's got a link, and if you don't look at where that link goes, you click on the link and it could expose some dropper that comes on to your system to gain that initial foothold. We might call that a stage 1 dropper. And then out of that, then a stage 2 could execute and launch malware or do various things. We'll talk about ransomware here in a minute, but this one particularly used WMI and PowerShell, which are tools that are already on your systems and thus become malware free by using them. There's no malware there. They're authorized executables. So why not use them? They did use some old known malware called CDaddy and a number of other techniques. The indicators of compromise were a variation of our adversary called Fancy Bear. Sometimes our intelligence people, they just stay up late at night and they're listening to some cool music and they name them that way. It's true.
These are the names you're giving?
This is the name that our company is giving. And then the press picks them up and...
They haven't gone to the dark web and looked up to see what they're calling
No,
themselves.
because they'll get it from us. They'll get it from like Mandiant, who calls them like APT 28. Like, How are you going to remember that? That's no fun. So, right, Fancy Bear. Isn't that fancy? Part of what our tooling does is allows us to see things in near real time, about 5-second delay. So we were able to actually see some of the commands, some active commands on the keyboard that were being entered to give us better clues, like what are they doing, what are they after, and to help identify them and to attribute them to previously seen activities. So there's a couple things that they used here. XAgent and XTunnel are some frameworks, some modular frameworks that are used to be able to upload files, download files, to be able to launch additional files or executables through, to really maintain that whole command and control infrastructure. They were tunneling much of this through an encrypted session that the endpoint was obfuscated with network address translation, so it hides their tracks. It leads to a dead end, and you can't really go further. When we look into the system itself, the actual what you call the shim cache or the history of prior execution, you can see that definitely data was exfiltrated. You can see what file names were and the commands that were used to do that. And unfortunately, because it was so long ago, we couldn't get any of it back. But we were able to piece together the timeline of what happened first and the different actors that were in play. Fancy Bear being the primary one, but there were two that were in our report. This came from our services casebook from last year, from our professional services team. And then really the only thing that you can do after you identify what happened is start to close up the holes. Reimage machines. They had to build a whole new domain infrastructure to kind of change the way trusts were being propagated. And we'll talk a little bit about why some of these things fail that would otherwise succeed. So, ransomware. Ransomware has been all over the news lately. It is not terribly difficult to avoid. Of course, watch the links that you're clicking. Don't trust attachments that come into your system. But there's some characteristics to them. They can propagate themselves into your system without using a phishing campaign. If the adversary is targeting you, they understand your infrastructure, they spend a lot of time doing reconnaissance on your infrastructure, and they find a hole for which they have an exploit. But nobody else knows about that exploit, so that's the 0-day part of it. And these are very valuable pieces of code and very valuable knowledge. Yes, you can buy them if you want, but they're very expensive, and they're really only good once you use them. An exploit, it's done. So you have to make sure that you're going to use it for some quote-unquote good. Ransomware can then, once it's running on your system, because a lot of times people are running as system admins, especially as home users. They will run, execute things from their temp directory or their download directory or something like that, which strangely enough, Microsoft allows you to do it. In the pro versions, you can turn off the ability to run executables from your download directory or your temp directory, which would kind of make a lot of these attacks not work. But strangely, Microsoft doesn't allow you to do that unless you upgrade to the pro versions. It can propagate further once they've downloaded some of these credentials, so that's why you don't use the same password on multiple systems, because once somebody has that password internally, especially if you have a team of system administrators, those credentials may be the same on other systems within the inside of your network. So if you have them on one system, then you can try them on another system, and oftentimes it actually works. And then you can start to look through the systems, you can start to try and find the domain controller, and then you can try and steal the entirety of all of the usernames and passwords from the organization, have all of the system administrator credentials, have access to all of the data that is within the organization. So those types of things can be included in ransomware. Of course, there's the encryption part of it. One of the more destructive ones will encrypt your master boot record on a Windows box. Or it could the boot sectors on your Macs or whatever as well. Once it does that, it's encrypted. Well, it can't run really. So your system is pretty much dead in the water. It may pop up a screen and give you your message and ask for payment in Bitcoin to be sent to a particular email address. Some of the organizations that are perpetrating this, and a lot of times it's the criminal organizations or the organized crime, because they want to get some money out of you. None of the stuff that we're doing in cyber is any different than the stuff that we do on the street, right? The confidence men and women of the world are they're just automating, just like all of our businesses are. So of course you want to make sure that you provide good support, because if you don't, you're not going to get the money. Your customers are never going to come back. So if you don't know how to get a Bitcoin, if, say, it's not in, the right language for you, well, they've got multilingual technical support. You can call them up on the phone and they'll help you get the Bitcoin. They'll help you make the payment. Sometimes, though, they won't necessarily give you the key, or the key won't necessarily work. That's okay, I guess, because once you have the money, do you really need to deliver the product? I guess that's what some are thinking. So there was the WannaCry ransomware was an occasion where they had a kill switch to it, and to where if you block this particular domain, then it would stop the propagation of the ransomware. So this one guy that actually got brought up on charges for something unrelated figured out how to stop it. He stopped the propagation of it, but it also kind of stopped the communication with the people that had the decryption keys. So it rendered it, not able to do anything, and data, couldn't be recovered. So if you're interrupting a ransomware within that process after it's been recovered and you pay the ransom, oftentimes you can't get it back. So the lesson here is, what's the lesson?
Back up.
Back up, yes.
Thank you.
Yes. It's really kind of simple. People have been telling people that for forever. Have good backups, test your backups, make sure they work, because backups or your system always fails when you have a tight deadline and when you've got absolutely no other way around it. It never fails. It's Murphy's Law. Never fails when it's convenient for you. It always fails when it's at its most inconvenient. So we've talked a lot about some very high-level things that are happening in our digital world these days. So why is it failing? Now, my opinion is it's failing for some very simple reasons that are avoidable. Most of our people are undertrained, they're under-equipped, they're understaffed, and they're overworked. We push each other super hard in order to get things done. In our development world, we push people to get the product out the door. We don't necessarily push high-quality code. We don't necessarily push secure code. Those things are not things that we really focus on. But also, the threats that the adversaries are coming with are much more complex. Executives that are making the decisions on what to spend money on, whether or not to permit somebody hiring, another 5 to 10 people, that's allocating a good, 500,000 plus or so in our field. Sometimes it's hard for them to make those decisions. The security learning curve for them is really steep. Employees and contractors, like I said, they're being pushed harder. Every budget dollar is scrutinized. So it takes a long time for the business justification to protect against future risk that may not materialize. So it's hard. If you don't have a guaranteed return, how do you make the investment, right? The tools that are being acquired by organizations, a lot of times they're poorly integrated. Or they're using the wrong ones. People are drowning in data. 27% of breaches were reported by a third party in that, the target attack. It was the HVAC vendor had, a bad password that provided them access to the infrastructure. They planted some malware. The malware was known. It actually beaconed out. The system did send the alert to the console, but nobody looked at it. Nobody did anything about it. The FBI They're busy. Because sometimes they go out and they find some indicators while they're doing an investigation that some other company was somehow involved or tangentially involved, and so they go knock on their door and say, hey, did you know? Were you aware that you have this problem? And then they would call in somebody to help them investigate. Processes. So part of my job in GRC is to focus on good processes, repeatable processes. The process has to work every time. The process has to be simple with a reduced number of steps to reduce the opportunity for failure. Because with every step, you have an opportunity for failure. So if you have 10 steps, you have 10 opportunities to fail. If you have 5 steps, you have half the opportunity to fail. So make it simple, make it effective. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people don't like to write. In organizations, the operations people, they don't like to write down their processes. They don't like to refine their process and reflect on whether or not it's working well every time. When I was a network administrator, and I had a philosophy that even though I was carrying a pager, we had pagers then, right? I never wanted to be called, but inevitably I would get called. And if I did get called, I was doing a poor job. I wasn't doing my job. I wanted to be taken for granted on the network, just like people take for granted when they use the phone. They pick up the phone, they get a dial tone. I want them to get network access, so it should be transparent to them. Everybody has a right to expect that, in my belief. And if you aren't focusing on that kind of excellence, you're going to fail. And that's where it comes in, like training. People have to care about what they're doing. If you pay them low, if you don't treat them well, then they're not going to care. They're not going to take pride in what they're doing. If you push their own training onto them, then you're going to use them for only what they came to the company with. And how long is that going to last? 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, until their skills become, not usable anymore, I guess. Yeah. So if we can somehow apply training or give people room to really focus on things, I think we're going to have better outcomes. And then we have better choices in technology, integrate the technology better, and then we can get somewhere. So we look at these kind of side by side. You heard me say in the beginning, adversaries, they are far better funded. You're talking about state versus corporation type of a thing. The F-35 is a great example of the failures of security of our defense industrial base. You have lots of different companies contributing to a project. That means you have to share a lot of information and somehow maintain it as classified. Somebody's eventually going to get it. And also with our complex procurement processes, that's why it ends up costing so much. So then you have organized crime, a lot of times versus the individual. That's where these ransomware schemes come into play. People need to have money. What they use that money for, if they're doing credit card skimming or something like that, they may sell it into the black market. You never know if it's some Russian organized crime syndicate, or if it's some terrorist group somewhere that's benefiting from these transactions. So they're more sophisticated. The whole con man thing is far more automated through that, and they're more patient. Our security teams in organizations, like I said, their funding is poor in where it matters. They are spending more, but everybody comes up with this new fancy thing that they want to try and sell you. But you have to have a vision for your security program, and you have to be able to tie it all together to get it working properly. You have to test it. So you have to hire skilled attackers to attack it, because it's better if it's somebody that's on your payroll attacking you than somebody who's not on your payroll attacking you. Chris?
You set up a honeypot front end to entice the adversary to come in on your by your route, by your desired method.
Yes. That's been a good technique. I think it's an underused technique that has been around for quite some time. Honeypots are a way that you can put a system out onto the internet or various places even on the internet, maybe not associated with your organization, to be able to gain intelligence about attack techniques. So say you have an unpatched Apache server or Nginx server out there, and you let somebody bang on it, you let somebody compromise it, but you're collecting all of the telemetry from that system that can add to your cache of intelligence on adversary techniques. That's one of the things that our organization does do a fair bit of. So I think it's a good technique. So yeah, our organizations are less patient, and there's far too much stress. So do you guys find some of this actually occurring in your organizations with your IT teams at all?
My son runs IT for a small manufacturer. He just got a ransomware attack.
Yeah.
Ended up having to pay in Bitcoin to some Russians.
Yeah.
So that's my personal experience.
Yeah, it does happen, and it's unfortunate. A lot of time there was some ransomware that would delete your prior backups as well before it did the encryption. So even if you tried to go to like your time machine or your Windows backup type stuff, or your system restore points, they were removing those so that you couldn't just re-image your box. So.
He did catch all the leaks and they got in. Fortunately, they delivered what they promised and he got his data.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good customer service, right?
It's a fair thought.
Yeah, I guess. So I'm sure that anybody who's worked in business has read The Art of War. And Sun Tzu said, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb. So these are kind of important words of wisdoms, and yeah, I tend to get metaphysical when we talk about security, but that's really part of the game. You do need to understand your adversary, and it does you no benefit to not try to understand your adversaries. Who's going to target you? How are they going to target you? Where have they targeted companies like you before? How have they perpetuated their tools, tactics, and procedures against organizations like yours? And then how do you defend against those things? Very important. So let's talk a little bit about next-gen endpoint protection. Do you know if your endpoints are currently compromised by a sophisticated actor? Are you protecting your remote users and compute environments that may not be on your premises against ransomware and other types of polymorphic threats? Do your existing security tools stop malware-free breaches? Some important questions to ask. So there's some characteristics that Gartner, the trusted advisors for technology, have come up with in terms of what is next-gen endpoint protection. So they've thrown in capabilities around anti-malware, personal firewall, port and device control, the endpoint protection solutions often include, that should have been indented, vulnerability assessment capability, application controller whitelisting, application sandboxing, where it kind of launches in a controlled environment so it doesn't kind of bleed out when the executable fires, so that you can, kind of like the honeypot, you can start to understand what the thing is trying to do before you decide to trust it. Enterprise mobility management, a lot of times that has to do, your phones as well as your laptops. Memory protection, endpoint protection and endpoint detection and response, which is a little bit more of the category of what our product is, where you have all of that really rich execution metadata from your systems collected into a cloud environment, a big data system that you can mine for data. Data protection, control of full disk and file encryption, and endpoint data loss prevention. So those are some of the characteristics. When Gartner comes out, they kind of put this laundry list, and then they take all of the organizations that claim to play in this space, and they rank them on, do they do these characteristics, and how well do they do these characteristics, and then they do their Magic Quadrant, which people go to. It's kind of a reasonable place to go. So our particular endpoint protection is cloud delivered, and it's enriched by the threat intelligence that I told you about before. We watch the adversaries. We understand how it is that the adversaries do their thing. And then when we get the telemetry data from the systems, we can look through that data to see whether or not we're seeing those tools, tactics, and procedures being used. And then we can trace it back to what are the endpoints within what organizations. And then we can send those messages out to say, hey, we've seen this, and this is what you should do about it. And that's part of the managed hunting. An endpoint? Yeah. That's a great question. An endpoint could be any device. It could be your mobile phone. It could be your laptop. It could be a server somewhere. It could even be a mainframe in AS400. It could be a router. I mean, any device on your network could be an endpoint, but it's typically referred to as a user-focused system, something that you're actually using or consuming, like through a server type of a thing. They're targets. They're definitely targets. A lot of reason why they're targets is because computers run programs as a user, right? So if you have access to data, then if I pretend to be you, then I can have access to data, right? And it's kind of an easier way to do it since you're not physically tied to the system.
These are all places where people interact with machines.
People interact with machines. But on a server side, we do also interact with it, but it's not like a direct, you're running programs from it, right? Okay, so the old enterprise architecture was this concept of like an M&M. You've got this crisp outer shell, and you've got this soft inner center, right? This soft chocolatey center. But this has a few problems in that when you leave the perimeter, when you go on vacation and you access mail from a hotel or you're on the go-go internet on an airplane or something like that, or if you're using cloud services for a portion of your network. These are places where you won't have quite as rich protection. So a modern enterprise architecture and many of the endpoint products are being able to facilitate this kind of a method. If I'm on an airplane, it can all send that telemetry data back and make decisions on that. So some of the value here is that all of the assets are protected. If we're doing it all in a cloud and you're subscribing to it as a service, then there's no hardware to deploy, no hardware to manage. It's all real-time updates. And then also, if we can centralize all the data from different companies, we can crowdsource that kind of intelligence about it and then be able to act on more quicker than if it was individual companies trying to do their own thing. So trying to get a little bit smarter and a little bit bigger scale. So next-gen AV, if we take a component of this, next-gen AV, typically AV was signature-based. You take an executable, you run it through a hashing algorithm, and you come up with a unique signature for that particular malware. Now, back in the old days, there were not so many signatures. But nowadays, there are far more. You could take a program, you could recompile it with just one character changed, and you have a different hash. So now you have variants of the same malware that are all pretty much the same and doing the same thing, but they all have different hashes. So they all have a different signature, which means each file on your system has to be compared against the signature database. It's a really laborious task. So we have to have machine learning. We have to have the known bad. Certainly signatures have a place in the next-gen AV. We have to understand the indicator of attack behavior, what it is that an executable is going to do, and then be able to actually block or mitigate what it is that it's going to do. There are about 12 ways to dump an administrator credential and password from a Windows system. we could look for 15 million different malware signatures, or we could look for the events that are triggering that activity, and which is what most of the malware tries to do. It tries to do something that we don't want it to do, so we could either look at the malware or we could look at the activity. And in our platform, we're looking more at the activity than it is the file itself. It's kind of important, but it's not the be-all, end-all. So like I said, when we pull all of this data together, all of this telemetry data, we're able to correlate all this in real time, be able to look at it in retrospect, because you get new information all the time. Once you have new information, you look back in the past and say, where have I seen this before? Because now I know of it now. I can have that cache of data to look back on. And then, of course, if you're able to have this this cache of data, then it allows you to do the forensics because you have all the data, and you can put together timelines. And then you can start to find the unknowns. I don't know if you saw that movie, The Unknowns, or whatever it was. Endpoint detection and response. So I touched a little bit on that. The DVR for the endpoint. We cache that data, all that execution data. It all goes into the central cloud. It's all keyed in terms of time. So you can go back and you can look at that data in the past and then report on what it is that you're finding. And the idea here is to be able to, once you have that new indicator of attack or that indicator of a compromise, you can look back on that historical data and you can reduce that time to mitigation, because now you can find every endpoint in your system that executed that particular file at that particular time, or that used that particular file, or made that call on that particular port to that particular domain, that sort of thing. You can search across the entire infrastructure. Computers are not perfect. We write programs, humans write programs, humans are imperfect. We write programs that are imperfect against use cases that are not complete. They don't cover everything. So you need to have that human capability in order to search for some things that just don't look right. That, when you have that, like, why did that happen? Why did that connection come in or go out? Why did that, why ever would we see Internet Explorer launch notepad.exe, right? Those are the kind of things that we can look for as humans and start to understand to enrich our capabilities of detecting these threats. So, so our endpoint protection platform kind of puts a lot of these together. We've got the host endpoint protection with the anti-malware, with the threat graph. And we've got the Falcon Overwatch, what we call Overwatch, which is our managed hunting service. And then when we talked about the adversaries and the capabilities and the tools, tactics, and procedures, we put that together too. So we have the technology, we have the people looking, and we have the intelligence to enrich our capabilities to then, enabled by the cloud to be able to stop those breaches and to intercept them wherever they happen. Any questions so far? Yes?
How do you actually stop the breach? Are you blocking the connection? I mean, are you based on the intelligence?
Yeah. So you can block the executable from executing once you know what it is. If it's a known, if it matches a signature, you just tell the system not to run it. If you look at how it is that it's executing, the different types of calls that it's making, then you can block it before it executes. Or, for example, in a ransomware executable, it's going to take some time to kind of ramp itself up before it starts its execution capabilities. So you can start to see some of that behavior that it's exhibiting, and you could block it during those types of behaviors that can then, trigger that that's bad. So those are just some ways that could be done.
And you have milliseconds or less to determine if you're going to block a connection
Correct.
or not.
Correct. About 500 or so. Ish. So it's got to be quick. And when it's cloud enabled, when it's operating over like go-go in-flight internet, sometimes you can have latency that can prevent it. But also, like for us, because it's in the cloud, once it detects it, then it can send the command to the agent to then kill the process as well. So you can, the best is to get it before. Sometimes that's not possible, so you get it where you can.
Are you looking at individual PCs in an office, or are you just looking at the servers, or what are you looking at everything?
Our platform and our competitors also support a wide variety of operating systems, from the host operating system like Macs to Windows to Linux systems to server operating systems, Windows Server, Linux Server type operating systems. Right now, our product doesn't support like mainframe or AS400 type systems, but many of the common systems that are out there we support. We don't support mobile devices right now. It would be great if we didn't have quite the data caps that we do, because it's a lot of data. It really is a lot of data, and that's where cloud enablement really helps out, because you can scale a cloud much more readily than you can scale your device storage.
Yeah, well, that's the reason I was asking. You keep calling it cloud, but I've got let's say I got 5 developers, 10 developers, 100 developers, they got all these individual
Yeah.
machines that are working on monitoring those individual machines.
Yeah, so we don't have a person that's looking at individual machines, but all machines are doing a lot of the similar things. People are executing programs, they're opening files, closing files. If you collect all that telemetry into one place, then you can start to analyze that telemetry in that one place, and then see what somebody's going to do something that isn't quite right. Right?
I think the connection is in. Yeah.
Is it geek in here? I'm full of a lot of static. I watched the eclipse, so
Well, that explains it.
it could be that something came down during that process. Yeah. So certainly there was a lot that was high level here, and I am providing a list. You guys can read those URLs, right? Right?
Absolutely not. That's the best protection available.
That's right. So really, that's the bulk of what I had planned for today. But I invite more questions and more conversation